All right, we have an entirely new unit, new packets and things like this tomorrow, new work, and this is progressivism. Now, the name of the game was, in the Gilded Age, make as much money as possible. However, there were a lot of problems that came out of this, and progressivism was about fixing those problems. Okay, we have three really big progressive presidents, and it's Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We'll get into them later. But this is the origins of progressivism. In this first video, we're going to focus on women and children. Now, first off, a lot of the labor that was done in the North during the Gilded Age was sweatshop labor. And what sweatshop labor basically is you have many people working in very poor conditions, little to no breaks, getting paid very little, and if they didn't like it or they got hurt on the job, they were easily replaced. So no workers' rights at all, no limiting of hours, and a lot of really crazy things. And if you read The Jungle, which my AP kids will read The Jungle, you'll actually get a lot of feel for this and the hurried masses that Jurgis and all these people went through. And it's really, really interesting, all right? Now, this all kind of comes to fruition in the 1900s with the, what was called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Triangle Shirtwaist, they made shirts that went to the waist in a factory and sweatshop labor. There was one door open, or available to be open for fear of theft. There was no sprinklers. There were no fire escapes. So when a fire broke out, the women, most of them are women, panicked, and they trampled each other, and the smoke inhalation, etc., trying to get out the one door that was available. And you can see here the cops have actually pulled some of the bodies out of this factory fire. Now, the New York Times, and they love reporting the bad stuff because that's what people want to hear, saw this, and the people were aghast. And they were, how can this happen? So a lot of reforms were put into place following this fire, and it's a big catalyst to really start changing the way that safety regulations work. Then we have a couple of court cases here. The first one is the Lochner versus New York court case. Basically, it dealt with a New York state law that said a baker could be limited to a certain number of hours. Mr. Lochner said, I need to work more hours to work for my family. The court said ultimately regulation interfered with the liberty of contract under the First Amendment, and as part of the due process protects liberty. In other words, you can't limit someone's hours unless they're wanting to. Okay? So Lochner kind of struck down that idea, and we go back to the drawing board, and they're able to do this. Now, two court cases that kind of went against Lochner. First, we have Mueller versus Oregon and Bunting versus Oregon. All right? Mueller versus Oregon was about women, and it said you could limit women's working hours to 8 hours a day. Bunting was then about men. So they kind of went against the Lochner case, saying you could limit the hours regardless of this because they needed this. And the whole slogan of the unions at that time was the 888, right? 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours with your family kind of thing. And you broke down the 24-hour period in that way. And really much hasn't changed, okay? Now, in those court cases, specifically Mueller, Louis Brandeis came up with the Brandeis Brief. Now, that has nothing to do with underwear, guys. Brief talking about court case. And you would think brief would be something short, and it's actually not, so maybe it's not a good name. But Louis Brandeis is actually the one who went out and got all this information and data and statistics and used it and said, this is why we have to do this. And it really changes the game and lawyers and how things are accomplished, because now they come in and they want to see all this evidence. 89,000 pieces of evidence, right? And that was started by Louis Brandeis, and he was instrumental in doing that. Now, we then have a woman named Florence Kelley who lived in Illinois, and we have the Illinois Factory Act. And this was twofold. Number one, it said that you could limit women's working hours, and it actually moved to stop child labor and go to a compulsory education model like we do have now. So she's very instrumental in trying to stop child labor. However, that's only in one state. We need something bigger, okay? So the big thing was the Keaton-Owen Act. The Keaton-Owen Act said you couldn't hire anyone under the age of 15 for working. And this was done in large in part to a lot of uh, pictures and things like that I'll show you later on with the muckrakers and Lewis Hines and the National Child Labor Committee. So this is going to try to end child labor. Now, they actually did an interesting thing with this, saying you couldn't sell goods across state lines that were made with child labor, and so you're limiting your markets, and you basically force the people to say, okay, I won't use any children. Now, the next thing we have is Taylorism. Taylorism is also called scientific management. This basically is where you break down a job into little tiny groups, and the whole idea is to increase efficiency, because that's the name of the game in progressivism. We want to make things more efficient, safer, and so that is Taylorism. Now, Henry Ford, one of the inventors of the assembly line, used Taylorism, and he thrived at it. Okay, the Model T, the first mass-produced car, is going to be used on the assembly line. He used Taylorism, broke down the job, and made his efficiency went up tenfold, and so the Model T is everywhere. And so that's a really important thing about Mr. Henry Ford. Now, the last thing here about women and children is the temperance movement. Temperance is kind of a cultural thing. I mean, if you've heard of The Wizard of Oz, you know there's a dog named Toto. Toto is a nod, if you will, to the teetotalers, the temperance, the ones who want to ban alcohol. Now, why are they so big on banning alcohol? Well, the sign here says, drinking leads to neglect of duty, moral degradation, and crime. Men used bars and saloons as a place to go and forget and to numb the pain that they were feeling in the industrial jobs. However, it also led to a lot of rampant hoboism and leaving their families behind. And so a group of women decided we want to ban alcohol. It's temperance, okay? Now, this all really started kind of in Cleveland. There was a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and you see their sign, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And so their whole goal is to get the country to say drinking is banned. That's the whole goal. Now, the really big woman here was a woman named Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was a teetotaler, and she had a little hatchet. See it right there? And she used this hatchet to go to these bars and destroy bottles of liquor. She occasionally greeted bartenders with cheery, good morning, destroyer of men's souls. And she'd just go in there and smash with these hatchetations, as they were called, trying to get these things to happen. Now, ultimately, they do succeed. The temperance movement, much later in progressivism, will get the 18th Amendment, which is known as the era of Prohibition. So temperance tried, right, you see where I'm going there, to ban alcohol, whereas Prohibition did actually prohibit it. Now, really easy way to remember that, at 18 you're not supposed to legally drink, and you can get in trouble if you're not legally drinking age 21, okay? So we'll come back to that. But that was the first video about women and children.